to grow during the 2010s, rising by about 15% between 2008 and 2022. Australia's robust economy, plus the fact that it's a sunny, open place, has made it one of the most desirable places in the world for immigrants. Australia has reliably experienced some of
We heard a news about Australia economy. Australia economy is very high compared to other countries, but nowadays Australia economy is downfall. What is the reason behind this? We are looking at all the reason in this video. So let's start the video.
This video is brought to you by Brilliant. For most of the past 50 years or so, Australia's economy has been the envy of the Western world. A combination of a reliable commodities industry and a strong domestic economy has allowed Australia to weather basically every major global economic crisis without entering recession, helping earn it the nickname the Lucky Country. However, in the past few months or even years, it looks like Australia's luck might have finally run out. After suffering its first recession in over 30 years during the pandemic, Australia's economy has struggled to recover. While GDP is still growing, this is only because of immigration, and GDP per capita has now actually fallen for 4 consecutive quarters. So in this video, we're going to look at how the invincible economy became vincible, and why things only look like they're going to get worse in the near future. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start with a bit of context, because Australia's recent economic history is pretty astonishing. Australia was originally nicknamed the Lucky Country in the 60s because of its abundance of natural resources, including iron ore, coal, copper, gold and oil, and its economic success has been built on exporting vast quantities of all of these around the world, especially to booming economies in Asia like China. Now, as we've mentioned in other videos, an abundance of natural resources can often be as much of a curse as a blessing because they can make your economy overly dependent on commodity exports. Demand for your natural resources can push up the value of your currency, making your other exports less competitive and making it harder for you to develop more advanced industries. Economies that are too dependent on commodity exports also often breed corruption and inequality, because politicians can develop overly cozy relations with the industry and fail to redistribute the export revenues, which then accrue to a small number of industrialists. This phenomenon is known as Dutch disease, and it at least partly explains the stagnation we see in many developing countries, including commodity exporting countries in Africa and oil exporting countries in the Middle East. However, Australia has apparently avoided the worst of Dutch disease, in part because even if Australia doesn't quite have a Norway-style sovereignty wealth fund, its relatively stable politics has allowed it to better redistribute its national income and nurture the domestic Australian economy. And it's this combination of a reliable export base and a relatively strong domestic economy that's allowed the Australian economy to fare so well in the past few decades. Australia's GDP grew every quarter from 1991 until the pandemic in 2020, the longest consecutive streak in world history. A strong domestic economy helped it weather the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s, which crippled its largest trading partner Japan, and a commodity boom driven by Chinese demand allowed Australia to sail through 2008. Australia today has the 10th highest GDP per capita globally, and Australians are some of the wealthiest people in the world. According to UBS's annual Global Wealth Report, Australia today has the 5th highest mean wealth and the 2nd highest median wealth in the world, behind just tiny Luxembourg. Unlike other developed economies, many of which have experienced wage stagnation since 2008, Australian income continued to grow during the 2010s, rising by about 15% between 2008 and 2022. Australia's robust economy, plus the fact that it's a sunny, open place, has made it one of the most desirable places in the world for immigrants. Australia has reliably experienced some of the highest immigration rates in the developed world, which has boosted GDP and protected Australia from the demographic crisis afflicting similar countries. Australia had its first recession in nearly 40 years during the pandemic. This wasn't surprising, but what has been a bit of a shock is Australia's apparent inability to get out of it. While Australia is nominally out of recession, this is only because of immigration, and GDP per capita has actually been falling. At the same time, wages have stagnated at nearly 10% below their pandemic peak, and living standards have been further squeezed by persistent inflation, causing 9 consecutive quarterly declines in real household income, the biggest dive in living standards in recorded history. So, what's gone wrong for the lucky country? Well, some of this is just a normal consequence of tight monetary policy. Australia's year-on-year inflation rate peaked to 8.4% in December 2022, lower than in places like the UK or the Eurozone, but it's proven remarkably stubborn, falling to 3.4% in December 2023 before rising to 4% in May of this year. This has forced Australia's central bank to aggressively raise interest rates, from 0.1% in 2022 to over 4% today. This has slowed down the economy, largely via mortgage costs. Essentially, because property in Australia is eye-bleedingly expensive, Australians spend a lot of money on mortgage payments, and when interest rates go up, so do these payments, squeezing household spending. But there are also some Australia-specific factors at play here. The first one we just alluded to, Australia's housing crisis. At first glance, you might assume that housing would be pretty cheap in Australia. After all, it's an enormous country with a relatively small population. However, because most of the population is concentrated in small areas, and because the Australian tax system actively encourages treating property as an investment, housing in Australia is actually inordinately expensive, especially in cities like Sydney and Melbourne. The ratio between the median house price and the median income has risen from about 3 in the 1990s to nearly 10 today, one of the highest in the world, and rising to over 10 in Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide. High housing costs are bad news for an economy for a whole load of reasons. They reduce domestic demand by forcing households to spend all their money on mortgage repayments or rent, and they prevent people from moving to high productivity areas like cities. The other Australia-specific reason is a slump in its exports. Australia's commodity exports have been undermined by a combination of falling global prices, with iron ore prices falling 30% this year alone, and weak demand from China, which has been Australia's largest export market for years now, but is currently struggling with its own economic crisis. But on top of that, Australia's largest service export, education, has also come under pressure recently. Before the pandemic, education, i.e. students coming to study in Australia, was Australia's 4th largest export behind coal, iron ore and natural gas. However, in the past few years or so, a lack of reliable domestic funding has made the sector increasingly reliant on foreign students, who essentially subsidise domestic students. However, as immigration has become a politically salient issue, largely thanks to the housing crisis, the Australian government has responded by cutting student visas, putting even more strain on the education system. All in all, things don't look good for the lucky country, and diversifying its export base while simultaneously deflating one of the world's biggest housing bubbles won't be an easy task. Understanding these kinds of issues is really important, but also difficult. That's why TLDR is here to help you. Unfortunately though, the world's only getting more complex, especially when it comes to tech and AI. Now, I'm not qualified to teach you about that, but luckily Brilliant are. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, programming, and AI. Brilliant is a learning platform designed to be uniquely effective. Their first principles approach helps you build understanding from the ground up. Each lesson is filled with hands-on problem solving that lets you play with concepts, a method proven to be 6 times more effective than watching lecture videos. For instance, if you did want to learn more about the increasingly important world of tech, you might want to check out the How Technology Works courses. That runs you through everything from how computer memory works to how exactly GPS can pinpoint your location, or why some online videos buffer, and how compression enables modern streaming. And although I did throw myself under the bus earlier, now I'm not qualified to teach you about that. Jack does have a degree in computer science, and he can tell you that
These courses aren't just high quality, they're also far more interesting than the lectures I sat through. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/TLDR, or click the link in the description. That way you'll get 20% off an annual premium subscription, and they'll know you came from us.
So friends, here is the video. We are watching a video about Australia economy downfall. What about your opinion in this about this video? Tell me in comment section. Okay, meet up in next video.